My name is Emma, and I'm 28 years old. What I'm about to tell you might sound impossible, but every word is true. At my own baby shower, surrounded by friends and family celebrating my first pregnancy, my mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and declared that my unborn child wasn't welcome in this family. What she didn't expect was the phone call I made that very same day. One conversation that would change everything and expose the truth she'd been hiding for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When I first met David's family 3 years ago, I thought I had hit the lottery. The Wellingtons lived in an elegant Victorian home in Savannah, Georgia, complete with wraparound porches and Spanish moss draping the ancient oak trees. Margaret Wellington, David's mother, seemed like the perfect Southern matriarch. She spoke in honeyed tones, always impeccably dressed, and appeared to genuinely care about everyone around her. Their family gatherings were straight out of a magazine, with perfectly set tables, home-cooked meals, and what seemed like genuine warmth. David was the youngest of 3 children, and from what I could see, the golden boy of the family. His older sisters, Catherine and Victoria, both lived nearby with their own families, and Sunday dinners at the Wellington house were a sacred tradition. When David first brought me to one of these gatherings, I was nervous but excited. I had grown up in a small apartment in Atlanta with just my mom after my father left when I was 12. The idea of being part of a large, close-knit family felt like a dream come true. Margaret welcomed me with open arms that first day, or so it seemed. She complimented my dress, asked thoughtful questions about my work as a pediatric nurse, and even shared stories about David's childhood that made everyone laugh. I felt accepted, valued, even loved. David squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that his mother already adored me. I believed him because I wanted to believe it, because it felt so good to finally belong somewhere. The courtship period with the Wellington family was like being wrapped in warm velvet. Margaret would call me directly, not through David, to invite me to ladies' lunches or shopping trips. She included me in family photos and introduced me to her friends as David's girlfriend with obvious pride. When David and I got engaged after 18 months of dating, she threw us an elaborate engagement party in their backyard, complete with string lights and a 3-course meal prepared by a professional caterer. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, the subtle ways she was already establishing control. She had opinions about everything related to our wedding, from the venue to the color of the bridesmaids' dresses. When I gently suggested we might want something smaller and more intimate, she laughed it off, saying that the Wellington family simply didn't do small celebrations. David supported her, explaining that his mother just wanted to show how happy she was to welcome me into the family. The wedding planning became increasingly stressful, as Margaret's suggestions became more like demands. She insisted on specific vendors, particular flowers, even the wording of our invitations. When I tried to incorporate some of my own family's traditions, she would smile sweetly and explain why her way would be better. My mother, who was paying for half the wedding despite her modest income, felt increasingly sidelined and hurt. I found myself caught between pleasing Margaret and honoring my own mother's wishes. The wedding itself was beautiful, I have to admit. Everything was perfectly executed, from the ceremony at the historic St. John's Cathedral to the reception at the country club. But as I looked around at the elegant decorations and carefully curated details, I realized that very little of it reflected David and me as a couple. It was Margaret's vision, Margaret's style, Margaret's perfect wedding. I pushed down the uncomfortable feeling that I had been more of a prop than a bride at my own celebration. The first year of marriage brought new challenges as I tried to navigate my role in the Wellington family dynamic. Margaret expected us for Sunday dinners without fail, and missing one for any reason was met with wounded disappointment and subtle guilt trips. She would call David at work to discuss family matters, often making decisions about holiday plans or family events without consulting me. When I mentioned feeling left out of these discussions, David assured me it was just his mother's way and that she meant well. Margaret had a talent for what I now recognize as backhanded compliments. She would praise my cooking while mentioning how Catherine made the same dish with a secret family recipe. She complimented my outfit while suggesting that certain colors or styles might be more flattering on my figure. Her comments about my work were particularly pointed. She would express admiration for my dedication to nursing, while noting how demanding the profession must be, and wondering aloud if I would be able to balance a career with family obligations. The subtle criticisms extended to our living situation. David and I had purchased a modest 3-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood, nothing fancy but perfect for starting our lives together. Margaret would visit and make observations about the furniture we needed, or suggest improvements that would make the space more suitable for entertaining. She offered to help us redecorate, which sounded generous until I realized she wanted to essentially redo everything according to her taste. When David got a promotion at his law firm, Margaret took full credit for his success, reminding everyone how she had encouraged him to pursue law and had connections that helped him get his foot in the door. She seemed to view his achievements as reflections of her own excellent parenting rather than his hard work and talent. This pattern extended to everything in David's life, including our marriage. She would often refer to how well she had raised him to be such a good husband, as if my happiness was primarily due to her influence. The holiday seasons were particularly challenging. Margaret had very specific traditions that had to be followed exactly, from the menu for Christmas dinner to the way presents were wrapped and distributed. When I suggested incorporating some of my family's traditions or hosting a holiday at our house, she would become visibly upset, explaining that the Wellington family had been celebrating the same way for generations. David always sided with his mother, saying it was easier to just go along with what she wanted rather than upset her. I began to notice how Margaret treated her daughters differently than she treated me. Catherine and Victoria seemed to have an understanding with their mother that I couldn't quite grasp. They would share knowing looks when Margaret made certain comments, and they had a way of deflecting her criticism that came from years of practice. They were kind to me but maintained a certain distance, as if they knew something I didn't about how to survive in Margaret's world. The control extended to our personal decisions as a couple. When we were trying to decide whether to refinance our house, Margaret inserted herself into the conversation with strong opinions about which bank we should use and what terms we should accept. She had opinions about our vacation plans, our choice of doctors, even the brand of car David should drive. Her justifications were always reasonable on the surface, but the underlying message was clear. She knew better than we did about how to live our lives. I started to feel increasingly isolated from my own family and friends. Margaret's disapproval of people in my life was subtle but persistent. She would ask pointed questions about my friends, jobs, or relationships, making comments that highlighted their shortcomings compared to the Wellington family's standards. When my college roommate visited from out of town, Margaret was politely,
"Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story."
dismissive, later commenting to David that she seemed like a nice enough girl, but perhaps not quite our type. Over time, I found myself making excuses to avoid bringing friends around or planning activities that didn't include the Wellington family. The pressure to conform intensified when David's cousin announced her pregnancy. Margaret's excitement was overwhelming, as she planned baby showers, shopped for gifts, and constantly brought up the topic of when David and I might start our own family. Her hints became less subtle over time, with comments about how much she looked forward to being a grandmother to our children and how important it was for the Wellington family name to continue through David's line. When David and I decided we weren't quite ready for children yet, Margaret's disappointment was palpable. She would make comments about couples who waited too long and missed their opportunity, or share articles about fertility declining with age. She brought up examples of other family members who had regretted waiting to start their families. The pressure was constant, but always disguised as loving concern for our future happiness. My work as a pediatric nurse became another source of tension. Margaret would often comment on how demanding my schedule was and how it might interfere with family responsibilities once we had children. She questioned whether I would be able to give enough attention to both my career and my role as a wife and mother. These conversations always ended with her expressing confidence that I would make the right decision when the time came, but the implication was clear. She expected me to prioritize family over career. The breaking point in our first year of marriage came during a family vacation to the Wellington beach house in Hilton Head. Margaret had planned every detail of the trip, from the sleeping arrangements to the daily activities. When I suggested that David and I might want to spend one afternoon exploring the area on our own, Margaret's reaction was swift and cutting. She expressed hurt that I didn't want to spend time with the family who had welcomed me so warmly, and questioned whether I truly understood what it meant to be part of their family. David was caught in the middle but ultimately sided with his mother, explaining that family time was precious and we could explore on our own any other weekend. I felt completely alone in that moment, realizing that in Margaret's world there was no room for independence or personal preferences that didn't align with her vision of how the family should function. I spent the rest of the vacation smiling and participating while feeling increasingly disconnected from my own desires and needs. The second year of marriage brought more of the same patterns, but I had begun to develop some awareness of what was happening. I started reading about family dynamics and healthy boundaries, trying to understand why I felt so uncomfortable and controlled despite everyone's apparent kindness. Margaret's behavior began to make more sense when I learned about covert narcissism and emotional manipulation tactics. I attempted to have conversations with David about setting some boundaries with his mother, but he consistently defended her actions and minimized my concerns. He would explain that his mother was just enthusiastic about being part of our lives, and that I was being too sensitive to her well-meaning suggestions. When I pointed out specific instances of controlling behavior, he would reframe them as examples of her love and concern for our well-being. The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. When I would express frustration about Margaret's interference in our decisions, David would remind me of all the ways she had helped us and supported our relationship. He would question whether I was remembering situations correctly or suggest that I might be misinterpreting his mother's intentions. Over time, I began to doubt my own perceptions and wonder if I was being ungrateful for the acceptance and support I had received from his family. Margaret's manipulation tactics became more sophisticated as she realized I was becoming less compliant. She began to use David as a messenger for her opinions and requests, making it seem like the ideas were coming from him rather than her. She would have private conversations with him about concerns she had regarding our marriage or my behavior, always framing her criticism as worry for his happiness and well-being. The topic of children continued to be a constant source of pressure. Margaret would make comments about friends whose children had given them grandchildren, and how fulfilling that experience was for the whole family. She bought baby items for future grandchildren, and would show them to me with obvious expectation. When David and I attended baby showers or baptisms, she would make pointed comments about how wonderful it would be when our turn came. Finally, after 2 years of marriage, David and I decided we were ready to start trying for a baby. I had hoped that pregnancy might give me some relief from Margaret's criticism, that becoming the mother of her future grandchild might earn me a more secure place in the family hierarchy. I couldn't have been more wrong about what was coming. When we announced my pregnancy at Sunday dinner, Margaret's reaction was everything I had hoped for and expected. She cried with joy, immediately began planning for the baby's arrival, and showered me with attention and affection. For the first few months, I felt like I had finally achieved the acceptance I had been seeking. Margaret called regularly to check on my health, offered to accompany me to doctor's appointments, and seemed genuinely excited about becoming a grandmother. The first trimester was blissful in terms of my relationship with Margaret. She was attentive without being overwhelming, supportive without being controlling. She shared stories about her own pregnancies and offered advice that actually felt helpful rather than critical. I began to relax and think that maybe pregnancy would mark a new chapter in our relationship, one where I was valued, not just as David's wife, but as the mother of her grandchild. As I entered the second trimester and we learned we were having a boy, Margaret's excitement seemed to intensify. She talked constantly about teaching him Wellington family traditions, showing him the family business, and watching him carry on the family name. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in her vision of the future. For the first time since joining the family, I felt like I truly belonged. The baby shower planning began in my 6th month of pregnancy. Margaret insisted on throwing the party, and I was grateful for her willingness to take on the responsibility. She had thrown beautiful events for Catherine and Victoria's pregnancies, and I looked forward to being celebrated in the same way. We spent weeks planning together, choosing themes and decorations, finalizing the guest list, and coordinating all the details. Margaret seemed to take special pride in planning this particular shower. She mentioned several times how this would be her first grandson and how special that made the occasion. She went above and beyond in every detail, from custom invitations to elaborate floral arrangements. The guest list included her friends, family members, and several of my colleagues from the hospital. Everything seemed perfect as we approached the day of the shower. The morning of the baby shower, I woke up feeling excited and grateful. Margaret had planned such a beautiful celebration, and I was looking forward to spending the day surrounded by people who cared about me and my growing family. I had no idea that this day would become the moment when Margaret's carefully constructed facade would finally crumble, revealing the truth about how she really felt about me and my place in the Wellington family. As I got ready that morning, applying makeup carefully to hide the fatigue that came with being 7 months pregnant, I thought about how much my life had changed since meeting David. Despite the challenges with Margaret, I felt hopeful about our future as a family. I was carrying the first Wellington grandson, and surely that would secure my place in the family forever. I had never been more wrong about anything in my life. The baby shower was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in early October. Margaret's garden was transformed into something magical, with white and blue decorations draped elegantly throughout the space. Round tables were arranged under the oak trees, each one set with fine china and crystal glasses that caught the afternoon sunlight. A dessert table displayed an impressive array of petit fours, macarons, and a stunning 3-tier cake, decorated with delicate baby booties and rattles made from fondant. I arrived early to help with any last-minute preparations, though Margaret assured me that everything was under control. She looked radiant in a powder blue dress that perfectly matched the color scheme, her silver hair styled in an elegant updo. She greeted me with a warm hug and guided me to the chair that had been designated as mine, positioned at the head table where I would have the best view of all the guests, and they would have a clear view of me opening gifts. The first guests began arriving shortly after 2, and I was touched by how many people had come to celebrate with us. My mother drove down from Atlanta, looking slightly overwhelmed by the elegance of the setting but proud to be there for her first grandchild. Several of my colleagues from the pediatric ward came together, chatting excitedly about baby names and nursery decorations. Margaret's Bridge Club friends arrived in their finest afternoon attire, along with various Wellington family members and neighbors I had met over the past 3 years. Catherine and Victoria were there with their children, and I watched as Margaret doted on her existing grandchildren, holding them close and whispering in their ears. She'd always been an attentive grandmother to their children, and I looked forward to seeing her form that same bond with my son. David mingled among the guests, clearly proud of his pregnant wife and grateful to his mother for organizing such a beautiful celebration. The shower began with traditional games and activities. We played the baby food guessing game, where guests had to identify different flavors of pureed food while blindfolded. There was a game where everyone wrote down advice for the new parents, and another where guests had to guess how many diapers were in a large basket. Margaret was the perfect hostess, making sure everyone felt included and comfortable, while keeping the activities moving smoothly. As we moved into the gift opening portion of the afternoon, I felt overwhelmed by the generosity of our friends and family. There were practical items like diapers and bottles, beautiful handmade blankets from David's aunts, and thoughtful books and toys from my coworkers. Margaret had arranged for someone to take notes about who gave what, so I could write proper thank you cards later. The gifts from Margaret herself were particularly impressive. She had purchased a complete nursery set, including a crib, changing table, dresser, and rocking chair, all in matching dark wood that she explained was a family heirloom style. There were also several outfits in ascending sizes, a high-end baby monitor system, and a silver rattle that had been engraved with the baby's expected birth date and the Wellington family crest. As I opened each gift, Margaret would provide commentary about its usefulness, or share a story about how she had used something similar when her own children were babies. She seemed to take special pleasure in gifts that aligned with her vision of how the baby should be raised, making subtle comments about items that didn't meet her standards. When my mother gave us a simple but beautiful quilt she had made herself, Margaret's smile seemed a bit forced as she noted how much work it must have taken. The afternoon was proceeding beautifully, and I was feeling genuinely happy and grateful for the celebration. The sun was warm but not too hot, there was a gentle breeze rustling through the oak leaves, and I was surrounded by people who seemed genuinely excited about the arrival of my son. I was about halfway through opening the gifts when I noticed Margaret's demeanor beginning to shift slightly. It started when one of my coworkers mentioned that David and I hadn't shared the baby's name yet, and asked if we had decided. Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and she glanced at David before answering that there were several family names under consideration. The truth was that David and I had chosen a name, Lucas James, but we had decided to keep it private until after the birth. Lucas was my father's middle name, and James was my grandfather's name. We hadn't told anyone, including Margaret, about our decision. When my coworker pressed for more details about potential names, David jumped in to redirect the conversation. But I could see that Margaret was bothered by not being in the know. She had always expected to be involved in major decisions about our lives, and the idea that we might be keeping something as important as the baby's name from her was clearly unsettling. The tension continued to build when another guest asked about our plans for the baby's baptism. Margaret immediately began outlining her vision for the ceremony, mentioning the church where all Wellington children had been baptized, and the reception she would host afterward. I had been planning to discuss these details with David privately before making any announcements, but Margaret was already committing us to specific plans in front of everyone. When I gently mentioned that we hadn't finalized those plans yet, Margaret's smile became strained. She laughed it off, saying that, of course, we would follow family tradition, but I could see the annoyance in her eyes. David looked uncomfortable, but didn't contradict his mother, leaving me to feel once again like decisions about my own child were being made without my input. The real trouble began when my mother mentioned that she had been researching childcare options near our house, thinking she might be able to help with babysitting once I returned to work. Margaret's reaction was swift and sharp. She turned to my mother with a look of confusion and said that naturally, the baby would be cared for by family when needed, implying that she would be the primary source of help. My mother, not understanding the family dynamics at play, innocently mentioned that she had taken early retirement specifically to be available to help with her first grandchild. She had been planning to spend several days a week at our house, helping with the baby while I transitioned back to work. This was something she and I had discussed privately, and I had been grateful for her willingness to make such a significant change in her life. Margaret's expression darkened considerably at this news. She had assumed that she would be the primary grandmother figure in the baby's life, just as she had been with Catherine and Victoria's children. The idea that my mother might have an equal or greater role in caring for the baby was clearly unacceptable to her. She began making pointed comments about the importance of consistency in childcare, and how confusing it might be for a baby to have too many different caretakers. The conversation became increasingly uncomfortable as Margaret began to assert her authority over the baby's care arrangements. She mentioned her extensive experience with babies, her convenient location just 20 minutes from our house, and her flexibility since she didn't work outside the home. She made it clear that she expected to be the go-to person for babysitting, doctor's appointments, and any other childcare needs that might arise. My mother, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its source, tried to diffuse the situation by suggesting that they could work together to support David and me. She mentioned how wonderful it would be for the baby to have two grandmothers who were so eager to be involved. Margaret's response was polite but cold, acknowledging my mother's enthusiasm, while making it clear that some arrangements were more practical than others. As the afternoon progressed, I could feel the mood shifting. Margaret's friends seemed to sense her tension and began making comments that supported her position as the primary grandmother. They talked about how wonderful she had been with Catherine and Victoria's children, and how lucky I was to have such an experienced mother-in-law to guide me through first-time parenthood. The comments began to feel less like compliments and more like subtle reminders of Margaret's authority in the family hierarchy. One of her Bridge Club friends mentioned how important it was for new mothers to accept help from those with experience, while another talked about the special bond between Wellington grandmothers and their grandchildren. I started to feel like I was being surrounded by people who viewed Margaret as the real authority figure in my child's life. When we took a break from gift opening for refreshments, I overheard Margaret talking to one of her sisters about the challenges of dealing with first-time mothers who thought they knew better than their elders. She didn't mention me by name, but the timing and context made it clear that she was referring to me. Her sister nodded sympathetically and shared her own stories about daughters-in-law who had needed gentle guidance to understand family expectations. I began to feel increasingly isolated at my own baby shower. The celebration that had started as a joyful event was becoming a subtle reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Margaret's friends and family members were lovely individually, but collectively they formed a force that reinforced her authority and made me feel like an outsider looking in on my own life. David seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, happily chatting with relatives and enjoying the beautiful afternoon. When I tried to catch his eye to signal my discomfort, he would smile and wave but not pick up on my need for support. I was learning that he had developed a talent for not seeing conflict when it involved his mother, a skill that probably helped him survive his childhood but left me feeling abandoned. The situation escalated when we returned to opening gifts, and I unwrapped a present from David's great-aunt Helen, who lived in Charleston. It was a beautiful christening gown that had been worn by Wellington babies for 4 generations. The dress was an antique white silk with intricate lace details and tiny pearl buttons. It was undeniably gorgeous and clearly very expensive and meaningful to the family. As I held up the gown for everyone to admire, Margaret became visibly emotional. She explained the history of the dress and how special it was that Helen had chosen to pass it on to the next generation. She talked about how David had worn it at his christening, as had Catherine and Victoria's children. The implication was clear. This dress symbolized the baby's place in the Wellington family lineage. When I thanked Helen and mentioned how honored I was that she wanted the baby to wear such a meaningful family heirloom, Margaret's expression shifted again. She seemed surprised that I assumed the baby would automatically wear the dress, as if the decision wasn't mine to make. She began talking about how the dress would need to be properly preserved and prepared, and how important it was that everything be done correctly for such a significant family tradition. Helen, sensing some tension but not understanding its source, mentioned that she hoped the baby would also wear it for his first Christmas photos, as had become tradition in the family. Margaret immediately began planning the Christmas celebration, discussing where the photos would be taken and who would be included. Once again, I felt like major events in my child's life were being planned without my input or consent. The final straw came during the last portion of gift opening. Margaret had saved her most significant gift for last, a trust fund she had established for the baby's education. It was an incredibly generous gift, worth more than most people, made in a year, and everyone gasped with appreciation when she announced it. I was genuinely touched by her generosity and thanked her profusely for thinking of the baby's future in such a meaningful way. However, as Margaret explained the details of the trust fund, I realized that it came with strings attached. The money could only be used for education at institutions that met certain criteria, meaning essentially Ivy League schools or prestigious private universities. More importantly, Margaret would serve as the trustee, giving her control over when and how the money could be accessed. When one of the guests commented on how wonderful it was that the baby would have such security for his future, Margaret smiled and said that naturally she wanted to ensure he received the kind of education befitting a Wellington. She mentioned specific schools that David and his sisters had attended and expressed her hope that the baby would follow in the family tradition of academic excellence. I began to see the trust fund not as a generous gift but as another way for Margaret to maintain control over my child's life. By making herself the trustee, she was ensuring that she would have a say in major decisions about his education and future. The money came with expectations and obligations that would bind us to her vision of what the baby's life should look like. As the shower began to wind down and guests started preparing to leave, I felt emotionally exhausted. What should have been a joyful celebration had become a subtle battle for control over my unborn child. Margaret's generous gifts and careful planning had come with an underlying message. She expected to be the primary authority figure in the baby's life, and any attempts to challenge that authority would not be tolerated. During the cleanup process, I tried to help despite my advanced pregnancy, but Margaret insisted that the catering staff would handle everything. She did, however, ask me to help her carry some items into the house, which gave us a few moments alone for the first time all afternoon. I thought this might be an opportunity to clear the air and address some of the tension that had developed during the shower. Instead, Margaret used the privacy to express her concerns about some of the conversations that had taken place during the party. She mentioned that she was worried about my mother's expectations regarding childcare, and suggested that it might be confusing for the baby to have too many different caretakers. She also brought up the importance of maintaining family traditions and ensuring that the baby understood his place in the Wellington lineage. Her tone was gentle but firm, as she explained that she only wanted what was best for the baby and for David and me as new parents. She mentioned her experience with Catherine and Victoria's children, and how smoothly everything had gone when proper boundaries were maintained. The implication was clear: if I wanted things to go smoothly for my family, I needed to accept her authority and follow her guidance. When I tried to explain that my mother and I had already made arrangements for her to help with childcare, Margaret's demeanor shifted noticeably. Her voice remained calm, but her words became more pointed. She questioned whether my mother really understood what was involved in caring for a Wellington baby, mentioning the family's high standards and particular way of doing things. She also brought up practical concerns about my mother's age and energy level, suggesting that caring for a baby might be more demanding than she realized. Margaret painted herself as the more logical choice for primary childcare support, given her recent experience with Catherine and Victoria's children and her understanding of family expectations. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with Margaret systematically undermining every arrangement I had made for the baby's care, while positioning herself as the obvious solution to any problems. She never directly forbade me from having my mother help with childcare, but she made it clear that she viewed such arrangements as impractical and potentially harmful to the baby's well-being. As we rejoined the remaining guests for final farewells, I felt like I had been put in my place. Margaret's message had been delivered clearly. She expected to be the primary authority figure in decisions about my child's life, and any attempts to include others in that role would be met with resistance. The beautiful baby shower had been as much about establishing hierarchy as celebrating the upcoming birth. The drive home with David was quiet at first. He was still glowing from the successful party and grateful to his mother for organizing such a beautiful event. When I tried to bring up some of my concerns about the conversations that had taken place, he dismissed them as pregnancy hormones making me oversensitive to innocent comments. He reminded me how generous his mother had been with her time and money, planning the entire shower and giving such meaningful gifts. When I mentioned feeling uncomfortable about the trust fund's restrictions and Margaret's role as trustee, he seemed genuinely surprised that I would question such a generous gesture. He explained that his mother naturally wanted to ensure the money was used responsibly, and that her involvement was a sign of her commitment to the baby's future. The conversation became more heated when I brought up Margaret's comments about my mother's role in childcare. David seemed to think his mother's concerns were reasonable and practical. He pointed out that his mother had more recent experience with babies and lived closer to our house. When I argued that my mother had raised me successfully and deserved to be involved in her grandchild's life, he accused me of being unfairly critical of his family. By the time we arrived home, I was feeling completely alone in my concerns. David couldn't or wouldn't see the controlling behavior that seemed so obvious to me. His default position was always to defend his mother and assume that any conflict was due to misunderstanding or oversensitivity on my part. I was beginning to realize that I could not count on him to support me when his mother's wishes conflicted with mine. That night, I lay awake, thinking about the baby shower and everything that had transpired. The beautiful decorations and generous gifts couldn't mask the underlying power struggle that had played out throughout the afternoon. Margaret had used the celebration as an opportunity to establish her authority over my child's life, and she had done so in a way that made me look ungrateful if I objected. I thought about the trust fund and how it would give Margaret leverage over educational decisions for the next 18 years. I thought about her dismissive attitude toward my mother's desire to be involved in childcare. Most of all, I thought about how systematically she had undermined my autonomy as a mother before the baby was even born. The next few weeks passed in a blur of final preparations for the baby's arrival. Margaret called daily to check on my health and offer assistance with last-minute preparations. On the surface, her attention seemed loving and supportive, but I was beginning to recognize the controlling undertones in her seemingly innocent suggestions. She had strong opinions about which hospital I should deliver at, which pediatrician we should choose, and even which room in our house would be best for the nursery. When I mentioned that David and I had already made these decisions, she would express surprise that we hadn't asked for her input on such important matters. Her hurt feelings became a tool for manipulation, making me feel guilty for not including her in every aspect of our preparation. The pediatrician issue became particularly contentious. David and I had chosen a practice that was highly recommended by my colleagues at the hospital and was conveniently located near our house. Margaret, however, insisted that we should use the doctor who had cared for all the Wellington children, even though his practice was across town and he was nearing retirement. When we politely declined to change doctors, Margaret's disappointment was obvious. She questioned our decision-making process and wondered aloud whether we had done enough research. She mentioned several times how much she trusted the family doctor and how important continuity of care was for Wellington children. The pressure was subtle but constant, wearing down my confidence in our choices. As my due date approached, Margaret's involvement in our lives intensified. She began stopping by our house unannounced, ostensibly to help with preparations, but really to check on our progress and offer unsolicited advice. She would rearrange items in the nursery according to her preferences, explaining that she had learned from experience what worked best. Her intrusions into our private space were becoming more frequent and more invasive. She had opinions about everything from the color of the curtains to the type of mattress in the crib. When I tried to politely decline her suggestions, she would remind me of her experience and express concern that I wasn't taking proper care of the baby's needs. The stress of Margaret's increasing control was taking a toll on my physical and emotional health. My blood pressure began to rise, and my doctor expressed concern about the potential for complications if I couldn't find ways to reduce stress. When I mentioned this to David, he suggested that perhaps I was making things more difficult than they needed to be by resisting his mother's help. I was beginning to feel like a stranger in my own life, watching as Margaret orchestrated every detail of my child's future, while I stood helplessly on the sidelines. The woman who had once seemed like the perfect mother-in-law was revealing herself to be a master manipulator, who viewed my baby as another possession to be controlled and managed according to her specifications. The breaking point was approaching, though I didn't know it yet. Margaret's carefully constructed facade of loving support was beginning to crack under the pressure of her need for absolute control. What would happen at the baby shower would be nothing compared to what was coming, but I had no way to prepare for the storm that was about to break over our family. 2 weeks after the baby shower, I went into labor 3 weeks early. The contractions started at midnight on a Tuesday, and by morning they were strong enough that David and I knew it was time to head to the hospital. In all the chaos of early labor, I forgot to call Margaret until we were already at the hospital and settled into the delivery room. When I finally remembered to have David call his mother, her reaction was explosive. She was furious that we hadn't called her immediately and demanded to know why she was being excluded from such an important moment. David tried to explain that everything had happened quickly and we were focused on getting to the hospital safely, but Margaret was inconsolable. She arrived at the hospital within an hour, sweeping into the delivery room like a force of nature. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours. Throughout the entire process, Margaret positioned herself as the primary support person, despite my mother having driven down from Atlanta as soon as David called her. Margaret had strong opinions about everything, from my pain management choices to the positions I should try during labor. She questioned every decision the medical staff made and constantly offered advice based on her own experiences decades earlier. When my mother tried to hold my hand during a particularly painful contraction, Margaret physically moved her aside, explaining that I needed someone with experience to guide me through the process. She took over coaching my breathing and insisted on being the one to communicate with the nurses about my needs. I was too exhausted and focused on the labor to fight her for control, but I felt hurt and angry that my own mother was being pushed aside during one of the most important moments of my life. Lucas James was born at 6:47 p.m. on Wednesday evening, weighing 6 pounds and 3 ounces despite being early. He was perfectly healthy, with a full head of dark hair and David's brown eyes. The moment they placed him in my arms, I felt a love so fierce and protective that it took my breath away. This was my son, my child, and I would do whatever it took to protect him and give him the best life possible. Margaret's reaction to her grandson's birth was overwhelming. She immediately began crying and reaching for the baby, wanting to hold him before I had even had a chance to properly bond with him myself. When the nurse suggested that it was important for mothers and babies to have immediate skin-to-skin contact, Margaret protested that she was the grandmother and had been waiting for this moment for months. The power struggle over who got to hold the baby first set the tone for everything that followed. Margaret acted as if she had equal rights to the baby as his actual parents, expecting immediate and unlimited access regardless of what might be best for the baby or what David and I wanted. When I asked for some private time to nurse and bond with Lucas, she seemed offended that I would want to exclude her from such a natural and beautiful experience. The hospital stay became a constant battle over visiting hours and access to the baby. Margaret arrived early each morning and stayed until the nursing staff forced her to leave at night. She brought a constant stream of family members and friends to meet the baby, turning my recovery room into a reception area. When I tried to establish some boundaries around visiting times, she accused me of being selfish and reminded me that family was the most important thing in the world. My mother, who had taken time off work and driven down from Atlanta to help during the first week, was constantly overshadowed by Margaret's presence. Margaret would arrive early and position herself as the primary grandmother, leaving my mother feeling like an unwelcome guest at her own grandson's birth. When my mother tried to help with diaper changes or feeding, Margaret would take over, explaining the proper Wellington family way of doing things. The naming issue became another battleground. David and I had decided months earlier that our son would be called Lucas James, honoring both sides of our family. However, Margaret had apparently assumed that we would choose a traditional Wellington family name and was visibly disappointed when she learned of our decision. She immediately began suggesting nicknames that sounded more formal and traditional, implying that Lucas was too casual for a Wellington baby. She also took issue with James as the middle name, pointing out that it came from my side of the family rather than David's. She suggested several Wellington family names that she thought would be more appropriate and meaningful. When David supported our original choice, she seemed hurt and confused that he would prioritize my family's traditions over his own. The christening discussions began before we even left the hospital. Margaret had very specific ideas about when and where the ceremony should take place, what the baby should wear, and who should be invited. She presented these ideas as facts rather than suggestions, making it clear that she had already begun planning the event without consulting us. When I mentioned that my family had some traditions they would like to incorporate into the christening ceremony, Margaret's reaction was swift and dismissive. She explained that Wellington christenings followed a very specific format that had been used for generations, and that deviating from tradition would be inappropriate and confusing for the baby. The coming home outfit became another point of contention. Margaret had purchased an elaborate outfit for Lucas to wear home from the hospital, complete with a tiny blazer and dress shoes. When I mentioned that I had already bought a simple but comfortable outfit for him to wear, she seemed personally offended that I would reject her gift. She explained that the outfit she had chosen was more appropriate for a Wellington baby's first public appearance, and that it was important to make a good impression from the very beginning. The implication was clear. My choice was somehow inadequate or inappropriate for her grandson. The drive home from the hospital was tense. Margaret insisted on following us in her own car and then staying at our house for the first few days to help with the transition. She had already made these plans without consulting us, and when I suggested that we might want some private family time to adjust to life with a newborn, she seemed shocked that I would reject her offer of help. Once we arrived home, Margaret immediately took over. She had strong opinions about everything from where the baby should sleep to how often he should be fed. She criticized the nursery setup that David and I had carefully planned, rearranging furniture and baby items according to her preferences. When I tried to assert my preferences as the baby's mother, she would remind me of her experience and suggest that I might not know what was best for the baby yet. The feeding schedule became a particular source of conflict. I had planned to breastfeed Lucas and wanted to feed him on demand rather than following a strict schedule. Margaret, however, believed strongly in scheduled feedings and tried to prevent me from nursing the baby when she thought it was too soon since his last feeding. She would physically take the baby from me when he cried, insisting that he couldn't possibly be hungry again and that responding to every cry would spoil him. When I tried to explain that pediatric experts recommended feeding on demand, especially for breastfeeding mothers, she dismissed modern parenting advice as trendy nonsense that went against proven methods. My mother's visit was cut short by Margaret's overwhelming presence. She had planned to stay for a week to help with cooking, cleaning, and baby care. But Margaret's constant criticism and interference made her feel unwelcome and unnecessary. When my mother mentioned that she felt like she was in the way, I realized that Margaret had successfully driven her away from her own grandson's first week of life. The sleep deprivation and stress of new parenthood were compounded by the constant battle for control over my own child. Margaret would arrive early each morning with specific plans for the day, including when the baby should eat, sleep, and be bathed. She treated me like an inexperienced babysitter, rather than the baby's mother, constantly correcting my instincts and replacing them with her methods. When Lucas was 2 weeks old, Margaret announced that she had scheduled his first professional photo session. She had chosen the photographer, selected the outfits, and made the appointment without consulting David or me. When I expressed surprise that she had made these arrangements without asking, she seemed confused about why she would need permission to document her grandson's early weeks. The photo session itself was a disaster. Margaret directed the entire shoot, positioning herself in most of the photos and treating me like an accessory to her vision of the perfect family portrait. She had strong opinions about which angles showed the baby to best advantage and criticized photos where she didn't like how I looked or was positioned. When the photographer suggested some photos of just the baby with his parents, Margaret protested that she should be included since she was such an important part of his life. She managed to insert herself into almost every photo, ensuring that the memories of Lucas's first professional photos would always include her dominant presence. The breaking point came when Lucas was 3 weeks old. Margaret had been escalating her control over our daily routine, and I was reaching my limit of tolerance for her interference. She was now arriving at our house by 7 each morning and staying until after dinner, essentially moving in without invitation and taking over my role as the primary caretaker of my own child. On this particular day, Margaret arrived even earlier than usual, letting herself in with the spare key she had somehow acquired. I was still in my pajamas, exhausted from a night of frequent feedings, when she swept into the nursery and immediately began criticizing how I addressed the baby for the day. She announced that she had invited several of her friends over to meet Lucas, and that she needed to get him properly dressed for company. Without asking permission, she began changing his outfit to something more formal and appropriate for visitors. When I protested that I hadn't agreed to have visitors and wasn't prepared for company, she dismissed my concerns as new mother anxiety. The friends arrived within an hour, treating our home like Margaret's personal salon for showing off her grandson. They cooed over Lucas while making comments about how lucky I was to have such an experienced mother-in-law to guide me through early motherhood. Margaret held the baby for most of the visit, only allowing me to take him when he needed to be nursed. During the visit, one of Margaret's friends mentioned how wonderful it was that Margaret was so involved in the baby's care and asked if I was getting enough rest. Before I could answer, Margaret responded that she was trying to teach me proper baby care techniques, but that some new mothers were resistant to guidance from more experienced women. The comment was made in a tone that sounded helpful and concerned, but it painted me as an incompetent mother who was lucky to have Margaret's expertise available. The friend nodded sympathetically and shared her own story about a daughter-in-law who had struggled with accepting help from her mother-in-law. As the visit continued, I felt increasingly invisible in my own home. Margaret and her friends discussed Lucas's future as if I wasn't there, making plans for his education, social development, and character formation. They talked about the importance of maintaining family traditions and ensuring that he understood his place in the Wellington family legacy. When one friend asked about my plans for returning to work, Margaret immediately responded that she thought it would be better for the baby if I focused on motherhood for the first few years. She mentioned that working mothers often struggled to give their children the attention they needed, and that fortunately, David's income was sufficient to support the family. This was the first I had heard of any expectation that I would quit my job, and I was shocked that Margaret would make such a significant announcement about my life in front of her friends. When I tried to clarify that I planned to return to work after my maternity leave, Margaret smiled indulgently and suggested that I might feel differently once I experienced the joys of full-time motherhood. After the friends left, Margaret launched into a lecture about the importance of putting the baby's needs first and considering whether my career was really compatible with proper motherhood. She explained that Wellington women had always prioritized family over personal ambitions, and that this tradition had resulted in well-adjusted, successful children. She also mentioned that she had been thinking about childcare arrangements for when I did return to work, and had concluded that family care was definitely superior to daycare or hired help. She offered to take care of Lucas during the day, presenting this as a generous solution that would benefit everyone involved. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but I recognized it as another attempt to gain control over my child's daily life. If Margaret became Lucas's primary daytime caregiver, she would essentially be raising him according to her standards and methods while I worked to support the family financially. When I explained that my mother and I had already discussed childcare arrangements, Margaret's reaction was immediate and intense. She questioned my mother's ability to provide proper care for a Wellington baby and suggested that my family's standards might not be high enough for Lucas's needs. She began listing specific concerns about my mother's methods, from her lack of recent baby experience to her different approach to discipline and education. Margaret painted herself as the obvious choice for childcare, citing her recent experience with Catherine and Victoria's children and her understanding of family expectations. The conversation escalated when I firmly stated that David and I would make our own decisions about childcare and that we didn't need her permission or approval for our choices. Margaret's facade of helpful concern finally cracked, and her true feelings about my role in the family began to emerge. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, cold and calculating, and completely devoid of the warmth she had always shown in public. Her voice remained calm, but her words were carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage to my confidence and sense of authority. She told me that I clearly didn't understand what it meant to be part of the Wellington family, and that my selfish attitudes were already having a negative impact on Lucas's well-being. She suggested that my inexperience as a mother was making me defensive and irrational, and that I needed to accept guidance from people who knew better. She went on to explain that Lucas belonged to the entire Wellington family, not just to David and me, and that major decisions about his upbringing needed to take the whole family's input into consideration. She made it clear that she considered herself to have equal authority in decisions about my child's life. When I responded that Lucas was my son and that I would make the decisions I thought were best for him, Margaret's mask slipped completely. Her voice turned icy as she informed me that I was a temporary addition to the family, but that Lucas would always be a Wellington, and Wellington children were raised according to Wellington standards. She explained that David would eventually come to understand where his loyalties should lie and that it would be better for everyone if I accepted my proper role in the family hierarchy. She made it clear that she viewed me as little more than a vessel for producing Wellington heirs and that my opinions about my own child's upbringing were irrelevant. The final blow came when she told me that if I continued to resist her guidance and authority, she would be forced to take steps to protect Lucas from my inadequate parenting. She mentioned that she had connections with family court judges and social services workers who understood the importance of ensuring proper care for children. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If I didn't submit to her control, she would use her influence and resources to challenge my fitness as a mother. She had the money, connections, and community standing to make my life very difficult if I continued to oppose her wishes. After Margaret left that afternoon, I sat in my nursery holding Lucas and crying with a mixture of rage, fear, and determination. Her threats had clarified something that I had been trying to deny for months. This was not a family conflict that could be resolved through communication or compromise. This was a war for control of my child's life, and Margaret had just declared her intention to win at any cost. That evening, when David came home from work, I tried to explain what had happened and how his mother had threatened to challenge my parenting if I didn't submit to her control. His reaction was exactly what I had expected, but hoped wouldn't happen. He accused me of misunderstanding his mother's intentions and suggested that my postpartum emotions were making me paranoid and irrational. He refused to believe that his mother would threaten legal action against me and insisted that I must have misinterpreted her words. When I tried to explain the pattern of controlling behavior that had been building for months, he became defensive and angry, accusing me of trying to turn him against his family. The conversation ended with David suggesting that I should consider counseling to help me adjust to motherhood and learn to accept help from his family. He made it clear that he would not support me in any conflict with his mother and that he expected me to find a way to get along with her, for the sake of family harmony. That night, lying awake next to my sleeping husband while holding my son, I realized that I was completely alone in this fight. David would never choose me over his mother, and his family would always close ranks to protect Margaret's authority. If I was going to protect Lucas and preserve my rights as his mother, I would have to find another way. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, who worked as a family law attorney in Charleston. Patricia had always been my favorite relative, someone who combined warmth and wisdom with a fierce sense of justice. If anyone could help me understand my options and protect my rights as a mother, it would be her. Patricia listened without interruption as I explained the entire situation, from Margaret's escalating control during my pregnancy to her threats about challenging my parenting. When I finished, there was a long silence before Patricia spoke, and when she did, her voice was serious and concerned. She confirmed what I had suspected. Margaret's threats were not idle, and she did have the resources and connections to make them reality if she chose to follow through. However, Patricia also explained that I had more rights and options than Margaret wanted me to believe, and that there were steps I could take to protect myself and Lucas. Patricia's first piece of advice was to start documenting everything. She wanted me to write down every incident of controlling behavior, every inappropriate comment, and every threat that Margaret had made. She also suggested that I begin recording conversations when possible and save any text messages or emails that showed Margaret's attempts to control my parenting decisions. She also recommended that I begin seeing a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and could provide professional documentation of the emotional manipulation and control I was experiencing. This would be important if the situation ever escalated to legal proceedings, as it would show that I was taking proactive steps to address the family conflict in a healthy way. Most importantly, Patricia warned me that I needed to be very careful about how I handled the situation going forward. Margaret clearly had significant resources and community influence, and she wouldn't hesitate to use them if she felt threatened. Any direct confrontation needed to be carefully planned and executed to maximize my protection while minimizing her ability to retaliate. Over the next few days, I began implementing Patricia's advice. I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Margaret, noting specific quotes and behaviors that demonstrated her controlling attitudes. I researched therapists in the area and made an appointment with someone who had experience dealing with narcissistic family dynamics. I also began reaching out to other family members to gauge their perspectives on Margaret's behavior. I was careful not to make direct accusations, but I asked general questions about family dynamics and how decisions were typically made regarding children and grandchildren. The responses were revealing. Several family members made comments that suggested they had noticed Margaret's controlling tendencies, but had learned to work around them rather than confront them directly. Catherine and Victoria, in particular, seemed to have developed strategies for maintaining some autonomy while appearing to submit to their mother's authority. When I spoke with Catherine privately, she admitted that she had experienced similar challenges when her children were born but had found it easier to let their mother believe she was in control while making her own decisions behind the scenes. Victoria echoed this sentiment, explaining that direct confrontation with Margaret never worked and that the key was to appear compliant while maintaining your own boundaries. Their advice was helpful but also disheartening. They were essentially telling me to accept a lifetime of manipulation and control, finding ways to work around Margaret's demands rather than addressing them directly. While this might be a survival strategy for them, I wasn't willing to live that way or raise my son in an environment where deception was necessary for basic autonomy. The situation came to a head 2 weeks later when Margaret announced that she had planned a second baby shower for Lucas. She explained that the first shower had been focused on gifts for the baby, but this one would be a proper introduction to the extended Wellington family and social circle. She had already sent invitations to dozens of people without consulting David or me, and had reserved a private room at the country club for the following Saturday. When I expressed surprise that she had planned such an elaborate event without asking, she seemed genuinely confused about why she would need permission to celebrate her grandson. The guest list included people I had never met, many of whom were Margaret's social contacts rather than actual family members. She explained that it was important for Lucas to be properly introduced to the community, and that this event would establish his place in local society. When I mentioned that I wasn't sure I was ready for such a public event so soon after giving birth, Margaret dismissed my concerns as new mother nervousness. She had already ordered a professional photographer and arranged for a formal receiving line where guests could meet the baby and congratulate the family. The receiving line arrangement was particularly troubling. Margaret had positioned herself as the primary host, with David and me as supporting players in her production. She would greet guests first, introduce them to Lucas, and then allow them to speak briefly with David and me before moving them along to the gift table. I realized that this event was not about celebrating Lucas or supporting our family. It was about Margaret establishing her authority as the primary figure in his life and demonstrating her control over family decisions to her social circle. She was using my son as a prop in her performance as the perfect grandmother and family matriarch. When I told David that I didn't want to attend an event that had been planned without our input and that seemed designed to showcase Margaret's control rather than celebrate our son, his reaction was explosive. He accused me of being ungrateful for his mother's efforts and selfish for wanting to deprive Lucas of the opportunity to meet his extended family. He couldn't or wouldn't see that the event was inappropriate and controlling, instead framing my objections as evidence of my difficulty adjusting to motherhood and accepting help from his family. When I suggested that we should be the ones planning events for our own child, he seemed genuinely confused about why that mattered. The argument escalated when I mentioned that I was considering not attending the shower at all. David threatened to take Lucas to the event without me, saying that he wouldn't allow my emotional problems to prevent his son from participating in important family traditions. His willingness to essentially kidnap our child and take him to an event I opposed was a wake-up call about how far he would go to avoid conflict with his mother. It also clarified that he viewed Margaret's wishes as more important than mine, even when it came to our own child. That night, I called Patricia again and explained the latest developments. Her advice was clear and urgent. I needed to take action immediately to protect my rights and establish boundaries, because the situation was escalating beyond normal family conflict into something much more serious. Patricia recommended that I attend the shower but use it as an opportunity to gather evidence of Margaret's controlling behavior. She suggested that I bring a witness, someone who could observe and later testify about what transpired at the event. She also advised me to make it clear to Margaret, in front of witnesses, that I disagreed with her planning events for my child without my permission. This would establish a clear record of my objections and make it harder for Margaret to claim later that I had agreed to her taking control of family decisions. The day of the second baby shower arrived, and I was prepared for battle. I had invited my mother to attend as my witness, and I had a small recording device in my purse in case Margaret made any threats or inappropriate comments that needed to be documented. The event was even more elaborate than Margaret had described. The country club's private dining room was decorated with expensive floral arrangements and formal table settings. A professional photographer was already taking pictures when we arrived, and Margaret had positioned herself at the entrance to greet guests as they entered. She was wearing an elegant navy dress and had styled her hair in an elaborate updo that must have taken hours to create. She looked every inch the perfect hostess and proud grandmother, but I could see the calculation behind her smile as she positioned herself as the star of the event. The receiving line was exactly as uncomfortable as I had anticipated. Margaret introduced each guest to Lucas as if he were her own child, making comments about his development and personality as if she were his primary caregiver. She accepted congratulations on his birth and thanked people for coming to celebrate our newest Wellington. When guests tried to congratulate David and me directly, Margaret would redirect their attention back to herself and the baby. She had clearly rehearsed this performance and was using the formal setting to establish her authority over Lucas in front of dozens of witnesses. The breaking point came when Margaret's oldest friend, Mrs. Henderson, made a comment about how wonderful it was that Margaret was so involved in raising her grandson. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that she understood I was planning to return to work soon, and how fortunate Lucas was to have such a devoted grandmother to care for him. Margaret's response was swift and devastating. She smiled sweetly and said, Well, we're still working on Emma's priorities. Some mothers need time to understand that family comes first, especially when they've grown up without proper examples of commitment and sacrifice. The comment was delivered in a tone of loving concern, but it was a direct attack on my character and my family background. She was implying that I was selfish and had been poorly raised, while positioning herself as the moral authority trying to guide me toward better choices. Mrs. Henderson nodded sympathetically and shared her own story about a daughter-in-law who had needed guidance about proper priorities. Other guests began chiming in with similar stories, creating a chorus of voices supporting Margaret's position and criticizing working mothers who didn't put family first. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger as Margaret continued to accept sympathy and support for her efforts to reform my supposedly selfish attitudes. She was using the formal setting and her social connections to publicly shame me while appearing to be the long-suffering mother-in-law trying to help her difficult daughter-in-law. When I tried to clarify that David and I had made our own decisions about my returning to work, Margaret interrupted me with a gentle laugh. She patted my hand condescendingly and said, "Emma's still adjusting to motherhood, and sometimes that makes new mothers say things they don't really mean. We all understand how emotional this time can be." The condescension was breathtaking. She had just dismissed my words as emotional nonsense while positioning herself as the calm, rational adult dealing with my supposed hysteria. The other guests nodded knowingly, as if they had all experienced similar challenges with emotional new mothers. The photographer captured this entire exchange, and I realized that Margaret had orchestrated even this moment to create a permanent record of her authority and my supposed inadequacy. The photos would show her surrounded by supportive friends while I looked angry and defensive, exactly the narrative she wanted to establish. As the event continued, Margaret's control over the narrative became even more apparent. She discussed Lucas's future education plans, his social development, and his role in the Wellington family legacy, as if these decisions had already been made. When guests asked about my opinions on these topics, she would answer for me or redirect the conversation back to her own expertise and experience. The final straw came during the gift opening ceremony. Margaret had positioned herself next to Lucas's carrier and was accepting gifts on his behalf while I sat slightly behind them, looking like a secondary figure in my own child's celebration. She opened each gift with commentary about its appropriateness and usefulness, sometimes making subtle criticisms of items that didn't meet her standards. When someone gave us a beautiful handmade quilt with bright colors and whimsical patterns, Margaret held it up with a forced smile and said, "How creative." I'm sure Emma appreciates unique gifts, though we'll probably save this for everyday use rather than special occasions. The comment was designed to sound gracious while actually being dismissive and critical. She was establishing herself as the arbiter of taste and appropriateness for gifts given to my child, while suggesting that my own taste was questionable. As the event was winding down, Margaret made an announcement that shocked everyone, including me. She stood up and asked for everyone's attention, then declared that she had a special surprise to share with the group. She explained that she had been so moved by becoming a grandmother that she had decided to establish a college fund for Lucas with a substantial initial contribution. The amount she announced was staggering, enough to pay for the most expensive private education available. The guests gasped with appreciation and began congratulating Margaret on her generosity, while I sat in stunned silence. This was the first I had heard of any such fund, and the timing of the announcement was clearly calculated to maximize her public recognition, while making it impossible for me to object without looking ungrateful. But then Margaret continued with the rest of her announcement, and I realized that the college fund was not a gift but a trap. She explained that the money would be managed by a trust, with specific requirements for how it could be used, and conditions that Lucas would need to meet to access the funds. She went on to say that she would serve as the trustee, and that decisions about Lucas's education would need to be made in consultation with her to ensure that the money was used appropriately. She was essentially buying control over my child's future education while making it impossible for me to refuse, without appearing to reject a generous gift. The audience was clearly impressed by Margaret's generosity and foresight, but I could see the manipulation for what it was. She was using money to establish legal authority over major decisions in Lucas's life, and she was doing it publicly to make it harder for me to challenge the arrangement. When Mrs. Henderson commented on how wonderful it was that Lucas would have such security for his future, Margaret smiled and said, "Well, children need proper guidance to make good choices, and sometimes parents need guidance too. This way we can ensure that Lucas receives the kind of education that will prepare him for his responsibilities as a Wellington." The comment was another dig at my judgment and authority as Lucas's mother, but it was delivered in such a way that it sounded like wisdom and concern for my child's future. Margaret had perfected the art of public manipulation, making attacks on my parenting sound like helpful advice from a loving grandmother. As guests began to leave, many of them approached Margaret to congratulate her privately on her handling of what they clearly saw as a difficult family situation. I overheard several conversations in which people praised her patience with my apparent difficulties and admired her commitment to ensuring proper care for her grandson, despite my resistance. The narrative had been established. Margaret was the devoted grandmother trying to protect her grandson from his mother's poor judgment and emotional instability. I was the ungrateful daughter-in-law who didn't appreciate the family's generosity and guidance. After the last guest left, Margaret approached me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She thanked me for attending the shower and expressed hope that I had enjoyed seeing how much the community cared about Lucas's future. Her words were gracious, but her tone made it clear that she considered the event a victory in her campaign for control. She then mentioned that she had scheduled Lucas's baptism for the following month and had already made arrangements with the church and reception venue. She presented this as a fait accompli, explaining that the date had been chosen to accommodate the schedules of important family members and community leaders. When I started to protest that David and I should be making these decisions for our own child, Margaret's expression hardened. She reminded me that the entire community had now witnessed my emotional instability and questionable judgment, and suggested that it might be better for everyone if I allowed more experienced family members to handle important arrangements. Her threat was subtle but clear. She had spent the afternoon establishing a public narrative about my inadequacy as a mother, and she was prepared to use that narrative against me if I continued to resist her authority. That evening, David and I had the biggest fight of our marriage. He couldn't understand why I was upset about the shower and accused me of being ungrateful for his mother's efforts to celebrate Lucas and secure his future. When I tried to explain how manipulative and controlling the entire event had been, he dismissed my concerns as postpartum depression making me paranoid. He was particularly angry about my objections to the college fund, pointing out that his mother had just given our son an incredible gift that would benefit him for the rest of his life. When I tried to explain that the fund was actually a tool for controlling future decisions about Lucas's education, he accused me of being suspicious of his family's generosity. The conversation escalated when I brought up Margaret's announcement about the baptism arrangements. David seemed genuinely surprised that I expected to be consulted about such decisions, explaining that his mother had more experience with organizing religious ceremonies and that her connections in the community would ensure that everything was done properly. I realized in that moment that David truly didn't see anything wrong with his mother making major decisions about our child's life without consulting us. He had been conditioned from childhood to accept her authority, and he expected me to do the same. When I said that I needed him to choose between supporting his wife and mother or supporting his mother's control over our family, David's answer was devastating. He told me that I was asking him to choose between his mother's love and support and my emotional problems, and that he couldn't understand why I was trying to destroy the family harmony that his mother worked so hard to maintain. His choice was clear. Margaret's wishes would always take priority over mine, even when it came to our own child. I was expected to submit to her authority, or be labeled as the problem that was disrupting family harmony. That night, I made the phone call that would change everything. I called Patricia and told her that I was ready to take whatever steps were necessary to protect my rights as Lucas's mother and establish clear legal boundaries around Margaret's involvement in our lives. Patricia's response was immediate and decisive. She explained that Margaret's public statements about my emotional instability and her establishment of financial control over Lucas's future education were clear signs that she was preparing to challenge my parental rights if I didn't submit to her authority. She recommended that I immediately begin the process of establishing legal protections for myself and Lucas. This would include filing for a custody agreement that specified my rights as Lucas's mother, documenting Margaret's inappropriate behavior, and potentially seeking a restraining order if her interference continued to escalate. Patricia also suggested that I consider whether my marriage to David was sustainable if he continued to prioritize his mother's wishes over his wife's rights and their child's best interests. She warned me that Margaret's campaign for control would only intensify over time, and that David's refusal to support me would make the situation increasingly dangerous for both Lucas and me. The next morning, I began implementing Patricia's advice. I called a local family law attorney who specialized in custody and grandparents' rights cases. I scheduled appointments with a therapist who could document the emotional manipulation I was experiencing. Most importantly, I began preparing for the possibility that I might need to leave my marriage to protect my child from Margaret's control. The attorney's assessment was sobering but not hopeless. Margaret's public statements and financial manipulation gave me grounds for legal action, but the process would be lengthy and expensive. More importantly, I would need David's cooperation to establish effective boundaries, and his refusal to acknowledge the problem made legal solutions more complicated. The therapist confirmed what I had begun to suspect. I was dealing with a narcissistic personality who viewed Lucas as an extension of herself rather than an independent person with his own needs and rights. Margaret's behavior would likely escalate as Lucas grew older and began developing his own personality and preferences. Over the next few weeks, I began quietly preparing for the possibility of leaving. I opened my own bank account, researched childcare options that would give me independence from Margaret's control, and began documenting every incident of inappropriate behavior. The breaking point came 3 weeks later when I returned home from a doctor's appointment to find Margaret in my house, having let herself in with the spare key, rearranging Lucas's nursery according to her preferences. She had moved furniture, changed his bedding, and replaced several decorative items with ones she considered more appropriate. When I asked her to explain what she was doing in my house without permission, her response was chilling. She told me that Lucas's well-being was more important than my sense of privacy, and that she had a responsibility to ensure he was being properly cared for, regardless of my feelings about her involvement. She went on to explain that she had been consulting with her attorney about grandparents' rights and had learned that she had legal options if she believed Lucas was not receiving proper care. That was the moment I made the phone call that changed everything. I dialed Patricia's number with shaking hands while Margaret continued rearranging my son's room. When Patricia answered, I said 5 words that would end Margaret's reign of terror. I need emergency legal intervention. Within hours, Patricia had filed an emergency restraining order citing harassment and threats to my parental rights. Margaret's shocked face when the sheriff served her papers was worth every battle ahead. Sometimes protecting your child means making the hardest call of your life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.